Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining Climatelinks and the USAID Comprehensive Action for Climate Change initiative for tracking climate progress, leveraging data analytics and AI for NDC targets. Again, welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on climatelinks.org in the coming weeks. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please use the Q&A button to add your question to the queue. Again, hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Climatelinks and the USAID Comprehensive Action for Climate Change initiative for this webinar today called Tracking Climate Progress, Leveraging Data Analytics and AI for NDC Targets. Again, please note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted on climatelinks.org in the coming weeks. And if you have a question for any of our speakers today, please use the Q&A button to add your question to the queue. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator to kick us off.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is John Heermans. I'm the Deputy Project Director of Comprehensive Action for Climate Change Initiative. The Comprehensive Action for Climate Change Initiative, or CACI, is a global USAID mechanism designed to help countries develop and implement ambitious climate policies and practices to mitigate climate change and increase resilience, in line with their Paris Agreement commitments embodied in their National Determined Contributions, or NDCs, and their National Adaptation Plans, or NAPs. CACI is implemented by APT Global and delivered with our partners, the World Resources Institute, International Institute for Sustainable Development, housing the Secretariat for the NAP Global Network, the Purdue University Applied Research Institute, and the International Food Policy Research Institute. And then we also team with partners at the regional level, such as Academia 2063, on delivering NAP and NDC support across Africa and with the Africa Union Commission. So the way we work is directly with countries and USAID missions around the world to identify and respond to priority needs for advancing on the NDCs and NAPs. We're developing enabling policies, investment plans, institutional capacities, and much more in a way that enables country to deliver on existing commitments and find new areas for deeper cuts in emissions or ways to increase local resilience. Part of our work and what countries are seeking support for is in better accessing, using, and synthesizing information for everything from informing policy decisions to designing projects to tracking and reporting progress on commitments, to facilitating inclusive multi-stakeholder policy dialogues. And this is where big data, digital platforms, and artificial intelligence can and is a central and dynamic, relatively new tool that's being widely tested and deployed. And while we see the many ways in which AI is being used in the everyday, from quick research on any topic, which is enabling, for example, high schoolers to cheat on their homework assignments, there are also complex development challenges that can and are being addressed through tailored AI solutions. It is also evolving extremely fast, and the industry as a whole is bringing new tools to bear, and organizations are testing discrete new AI platforms in creative and innovative ways. Today, we'll set the stage with a discussion on where AI is currently heading, what questions it is seeking to answer in the context of international development and climate change. From there, we'll hear from WRI on what big digital platforms are already out there to track the NDCs and the Paris Agreement, and how AI is being explored to move even further in making country-level climate action more transparent and granular. And finally, we'll hear how institutions in Africa are likewise developing digital services for tracking climate action, and what AI can also do to further push climate agendas at the country level. Our hope from today's session is that participants have a greater understanding on the role of AI in climate development and walk away with their own thoughts, questions, and ideas on how data tools can be better used to support climate action and track and measure NDC implementation. So with no further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker from APT Global, Mr. Leland Smith, Digital Development Advisor. Leland is a technology and development expert in APT Global's Data and Digital Services Group. He's been working on the intersection of information and communication technologies and international development for over 15 years. He supports APP's work in climate change, the development of tailored digital solutions. And so, Leland, thank you for joining our panel today. I think my first questions to you are a bit of a cheat in that I'm asking many kind of bundled into one or two. So we'd be interested in hearing just generally AI as this industry or sector. How is big data and AI being used for development purposes? Is it early stage? Is it advanced? Or is it still in test mode? What are the major industry touch points or dialogues surrounding what it comes to integrating AI to solve real world problems? And then how can AI help with social inclusion and making highly technical information more easily accessible and understandable, those that need to be involved more deeply in climate change decision and policy making would have limited entry to? So with that, Leland, over to you.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for having me here today. I'm just going to pop my presentation up here today. I will not take too much of your time today, but I'd really like to, as John said, lay a bit of the background here on sort of where we are with AI, in particular related to tracking our progress towards our climate commitments. But want to leave plenty of time for the actual interesting stuff, some of the platforms that we're going to be showing off today. So, some of the challenges that we have with tracking climate progress is obviously that the data can be really, really challenging. Right off the bat, we're measuring things at a nationwide level. We're measuring them across multiple industries, the public sector, the private sector. So data is really hard to acquire. It's hard to validate. It's hard to integrate it. Models, of course, are highly technical, and that kind of depth of technical expertise isn't common, across the developed world, let alone the global South. Coordination among institutions and sharing this data can be extremely difficult. And lastly, and starting to hint at John's last question, participation, particularly among marginalized groups, can be really difficult to include all those groups in dialogue. CSOs and citizens need scientific and data literacy. They need to, to feel included, and they need to have that conversation brought to them. A couple opportunities here that we'll dive into a little bit more is specifically focusing on big data and analytical tools, and then AI and machine learning. Big data and a lot of analytical tools that have really grown and matured in the last 10 to 15 years have made things like large-scale data integration on an automated way much easier. It's made data exploration much more natural, and it makes data platforms a lot more user-friendly and easy to explore for non-technical audiences. In recent years, obviously, AI and machine learning have become the big things, and those are, I think, sort of furthering a lot of those advantages. So thinking, for instance, about using geospatial and remotely sensed data to track sources of emissions, using natural language processing to understand and interpret text data, and then of course generative AI, which must of course be brought up, provides a really easy to use interface for a broader audience for this kind of data. I'm going to talk a little bit about AI specifically, but I think when we talk about AI, you can sort of read, big data underlying all of it, because of course, AI is really built on top of a lot of this. And I wanted to talk sort of specifically about kind of where we are globally. This is the Gartner hype curve. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I'm a big fan. It plots emerging technologies from the beginning, sort of innovation and growth. This is the peak of inflated expectations, which should sound familiar in generative AI. This is the trough of disillusionment, then we go into the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity. So this is sort of a way a lot of these technologies grow. And as you can see here, this year, Gartner has positioned generative AI being, of course, ChatGPT, DALL-E, image generation, et cetera, really right at this point where we're going to start to see it drop into this trough of disillusionment. And indeed, I think the global conversation has turned in I think a largely justified way towards skepticism and a little bit more caution about AI tools. Of course, in the private sector, we're seeing an explosion in AI development, whether it's predictive modeling, which of course has been around for a long time, but is growing, or generative AI in terms of text interfaces, ChatGPT, et cetera. We're seeing explosive growth in the private sector. Some would say reckless growth in a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of validity to that conversation. But in the public sector and in development, I think we're characterized a lot more by optimistic caution. So there's a sense that we need to take all of these steps more carefully, ethically, equitably, build trust in the kind of tools that we're building. We shouldn't, in this sector where we're working with, vulnerable populations, we should not be, slapping together tools, finding out later that, our chatbot is lying to somebody who may not be able to, discern that difference and cause a lot of harm to people and, just sort of wash our hands of it and walk away. That's of course, that's not an option. It's never been an option. So what we're seeing, of course, is public institutions such as USAID, but including World Bank, FCDO, many other development institutions, making big investments in policy, in AI governance, and putting a lot of really, really thoughtful work down on how we proceed in this space. So USAID in particular has an AI action plan. They just released an AI playbook just in the last few weeks. I would encourage everybody here to check it out. It's an extremely informative and well thought out document. USAID's digital policy calls out AI specifically. And the climate strategy, of course, emphasizes that aspect that we were talking about of sort of bringing data and insights to the populations and the people who need it. So all that is to say is that there's a wealth of knowledge out there, and we know that USAID is thinking about it and really taking a leading role in guiding our hand as we implement projects. Some of the concerns that we have, and some of them that I just hinted at, and I'm not going to go through all of these. I think anybody who follows the conversation on AI and generative AI in particular is going to be aware of these things. But I think with climate in particular, it's important because a lot of these are getting at questions of equity, biased training data, the inability to explain outputs of a model. Can be really challenging and really harmful if that data is getting down to folks who don't necessarily know how to interpret it and correct for errors. We all know about the so-called hallucinations where chatbots make things up. If we're doing something like, say, using a chatbot to read through a treasure trove of climate change reports, we absolutely cannot tolerate misinformation and made up facts coming out of that. And in addition, climate change has become a political issue, of course. And these kinds of tools also open the doors up to misinformation at scale. And that's something that we need to constantly be vigilant of. But all is not lost. And I think, John, this is where we're getting to sort of some of that question of how these technologies can be really useful. I won't necessarily read through all of these, but I think what it all comes down to is bridging the gap between that highly technical climate information and the people who really need to access that information and use it to take action, whether it's a civil society organization, group of indigenous peoples, et cetera. And so we're able to overcome language barriers. We're able to overcome barriers of data literacy and scientific literacy, and at scale, really deliver critical information to those that that need it most. And that's what I have there so far for a way of background. And John, I will turn it right back to you.
Thank you, Leland. I really appreciated your points on cautious optimism and some of the ways in which we're already thinking about how AI, despite the hallucinations, the risks, also I think can address these questions of equity and translating big information, highly technical information, into meaningful ways that is user ready at the ground level. So I'm looking forward to watching that evolves and seeing how people or organizations can roll this out in a way that harnesses its power with reducing its risks. For our next speaker, I'm turning to Leandro Vigna with the ClimateWatch Data Partnership and Outreach Manager with the World Resources Institute. Leandro has, over the last 4 years, worked extensively on data platforms, managing products and leading outreach efforts. His primary work has been with ClimateWatch, but he's also served as the project manager for the Systems Change Lab and contributed to the creation of the AgriAdapt platform. So Leandro, from WRI's perspective, how does your organization enable transparency on what countries are committing to under the Paris Agreement through its own digital resources and platforms? And what is it exploring in terms of enabling AI to advance climate action and information services through its own efforts globally?
Awesome. Hey, John, and thanks so much for inviting me here to be presenting the platform today. I hope I can answer the 2 questions through my very brief presentation. So the way I plan this session, it's basically first to talk a little bit about ClimateWatch and what is that the platform does, and then speak about our initial steps that we're taking on AI. And then please, at any point, if you have any questions, just feel free to add them in the Q&A or the chat box. And then at the end, we're going to be responding all questions with my other panelists. So getting started with ClimateWatch, I wanted to first mention that ClimateWatch platform belongs to the World Resources Institute, which is a global environmental think tank that works on several environmental issues. ClimateWatch is the signature platform keeping track of the key climate commitments from countries, but WRI also has plenty of other data platforms such as Global Forest Watch, Aqueduct, that keep track and do a lot of analysis with data on different topics such as forest, water risk, etc. That I invite you also to explore. And just to mention that we are all these different platforms starting to incorporate AI into our processes, or at least starting to think about it. I would say it's very initial stages. Now, and before I jump into the live demo of what the platform does, I want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by the signature platform, keeping track of climate commitments. What I mean by that is the key climate commitments that came out of the Paris Agreement. I believe most in here might be familiar with this legally binding agreement with the goal of reducing global warming to ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then the documents that we keep track of are essentially the nationally determined contributions. So the most substantial documents where countries lay out what are their targets and measure that they want to put forward in order to reduce global warming to the goal of the Paris Agreement. And we keep track of every single iteration of this document, which comes every 5 years. Now, in addition to the NDCs, we keep track of the long-term strategies and also the net zero targets, which are both also asked and suggested to submit by the Paris Agreement. And now, having said that, I want to focus now on what the platform delivers and more specifically to speak about the NDCs. So then I can talk a little bit more about how we're thinking of incorporating AI into our analysis. So this is the homepage of the ClimateWatch platform. And then from here, you can access to all our different modules by accessing this upper tab in there. There are different ways of using ClimateWatch. For example, if you want to get the context of a specific country, or if you want to dive really deep into a particular topic that you're keeping track of. So for various use cases, I would suggest different ways. Today, the focus is on NDCs. So if you're looking into learning more about what the world is doing or what a country is committing to in terms of the climate commitments, I would suggest then going to the commitments section. And here you can see we have quite a few modules. We have 2 related to NDCs, and then a tracker on long-term strategies and on net zero targets. And then a tool that also allows users to compare between different NDCs. For now, I'm just going to be focusing on the Explore NDC tool. And then from here, I want to first cover briefly what it has. We can see from the top down, we have these different drop-down boxes. So from here, users can filter the data from the NDCs, depending on what document you want to learn about. By default, it shows you the latest NDC of each country, but we keep track of all versions of NDCs, ranging from INDCs to first NDCs and second NDCs. And now we're getting ready to the next round of NDCs. After that, by default, it shows you the latest one. And then if you want to dive deeper into a specific topic, we analyze and keep track of more than 150 indicators comparable across all countries and all different versions of NDCs within the same country. And so putting a long list of 200 indicators wouldn't be the most convenient. So we break them down into categories and indicators. So for categories, by default, we show you the UNFCCC process, basically just telling you what's the latest NDC version that a country submitted. And we can see the data reflected in the colors of the map. It's also reflected here in the legend. We can see that 176 parties submitted a new or updated NDC, which represents 94% of global emissions. Now, if we want to know more about, for example, finance or on any mitigation or adaptation measures, we do have categories for those topics. In this case, let's say that I work for a government and I want to learn more about energy-related indicators that countries are keeping in mind for their climate commitment. In that case, I can go to the category sectoral mitigation measures. We can see how the map automatically changes. Also worth mentioning, if you keep scrolling down, every time you see a map on our platform, you're going to be able to see a table underneath, which it's essentially giving the same information, but it allows you to access the country pages from different countries and to sort out the information. In case you want to know or organize the data by the latest submission or by the countries that have the greatest share of global emissions. Now, I changed to sectoral mitigation, and I see in the indicator section that I have agriculture, building, economy-wide, so all the different sectors. I say that I'm interested in energy. So for that, I can click on the energy tab, and I can see that 154 parties, on the yellow one, have a sectoral measure specified related to energy. And as I hover over different countries, I can see if they don't have it, or if the country has it, which specific measures they do have mentioned there. Now, a good thing about these sectoral mitigation measures is that we include sub-sectors and sub-indicators. So for energy, let's say I'm not just interested in energy as a whole, but energy in hydrogen, because I'm tracking the transition to more renewable energy sources. In that case, I can just scroll down and see if we have that one covered. In this case, we do follow and have an indicator on hydrogen. We can see that the more specific you get on a topic, the fewer countries may have a mention on it. In this case, we can see that out of the 154 parties that had an energy-related measure, now only 17 have a measure related to hydrogen. Now here you can see if there is a sectoral measure specified, but what if I want to know exactly what is that measure? In that case, we do have the functionality of simply clicking on top of the country, and it takes you to the NDC page of the country. From here, we can see that here at the top, it shows you that it's a second national intermittent contributions. And as we scroll down, we have some top line targets and high-level numbers from the country, a summary of what are the key topics that it covers. And then we have all these plus 200 indicators split into these 4 different tabs. They go from overview, mitigation, adaptation, and sectoral information. For this demo, we were interested in energy-related indicators, and more specifically into hydrogen. And so for that, we can go to the sectoral information. And then from here, that will fall under sectoral mitigation measures. We expand it, and we can see all the different measures that the country has. And then you can simply sort it out by going to energy, and then finding the one I was looking for, which is hydrogen. In this case, I can see that there is a sectoral measure. Specifically, it's using basically to promote a sustainable energy matrix, focusing on gasification, biofuels, and electrification of mobility, and the use of hydrogen. Now, if you're not familiar with NDCs, this could be a very long document, up to 220 pages. I think that's the case of Malaysia. But through our platform, you're able to access very transparently all the information with just a couple of clicks. In this case, and it's also worth mentioning, we don't reinterpret the data. We try to be as transparent as possible. So we're basically taking excerpts from the original NDC so that any expert or any user can really make their own interpretation of the data and make their own assessment. So in that case, we remain neutral. Nonetheless, it's not the case of the Institute as a whole. We do have climate experts that go, they access our data, they see it objectively, and then they make their own statements on whether a country could be more ambitious on any topic, or if it's falling behind compared to other countries in a similar situation. Now, here's how we basically gather all the indicators that we have analyzed. Now, if there's any topic that might be too niche, for example, let's say we're working on energy and we're interested in hydrogen, but not just hydrogen. We want to know about green hydrogen. In that case, we can use this search keyword phrase, which is basically a Google for NDCs, and we can type down the term that we're interested in. So in this case, green hydrogen. And it will show you all the documents in the world and how many parties have a mention of this term into their NDC. So here we can go, for example, to any country that we're interested in. Let's say I want to see what Canada it's bringing up in terms of green hydrogen. For compounded terms, you need to scroll down a little bit, and you can see in here, for example, that they mention including bioenergy and green hydrogen. You get some context, but if you click there, you can see the original NDC documents and the context where the term that you're interested in, it's been mentioned. So it highlights the term, and you can see how it's mentioned as one of the action plans that it's aiming to do with this budget. Now, I want to jump into how we use AI, and there's so much more I could talk about from ClimateWatch, but specifically focusing on NDCs. I don't know what your expectations might be, but in order to do all these analysis from all countries and all the different indicators, we only have 3 people. So 3 data colleagues that work, and every time there's a new NDC, they go, they read through the document and start extracting all the information and put it into a massive spreadsheet. So to give you just an idea on how all this information on sectoral indicators that it's so beautifully laid out in here, on the back end, it looks something like this. So it's a massive, massive spreadsheet. I can keep going, scrolling down for quite a long time. And basically, this is a manual labor that we're doing right now. Going into every NDC and then categorizing all these different sentences or even paragraphs, if they belong to agriculture, to the sub-indicator crops, what's our indicator for it, and what's the value that we have. And as you can imagine, this is a very time-consuming effort. So the way we're thinking about incorporating AI into our processes, it's basically to leverage the capacities of large learning modules to analyze the data and ideally export it into a tabular format like this, so you can save up some time. It isn't really a challenge when we have 1 or 2 NDCs at the time, but we've seen through different runs of NDCs that sometimes there are 25 countries submitting on the same week, and we really don't have the capacity for it. So very quickly covering, because we're just at the initial stages of using AI, our short-term goal will basically be to design and validate a first version of the tool so that we can basically prove that it can be done that we can extract relevant information to cover all these different mitigation targets, adaptation targets, and then we can, after that, expand it into the whole analysis that we do for the 100 plus 50 indicators. That's a short term. So if we can at least get the sectoral mitigation measures out of the NDCs, that would be great. And then ideally, we can use that information and expand it so we can use it for all the other indicators that we have and for other documents as well. So here, it's an illustration on how this would work. We get the new NDC, we put it into the AI tool, and then it exports a spreadsheet with all the new data, and we simply upload the data on ClimateWatch. So far, we're far from it, but we're at the initial stages, and we do have some promising results so far. So here, just basically restating what I just covered. Also, once we can do it for the NDCs, which we have extensive data for the artificial intelligence models that they can use. Once we do that, we can expand it, the analysis to, for example, national adaptation plans, to biannual transparency reports, which it would really save us a lot of time. And there's so much important information that we could gather from there. And here's just a quick show of the tool that we have right now. And right now, it's basically responding to questions. So it gets a text extract from an NDC. It determines if it belongs to mitigation or adaptation. And then we have to basically be testing if the data that it gives back, it's accurate, if it serves, and if we could use it. So the model is still learning from us and from the data that we have. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to John. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Leandro. That's a really good example of, first, congratulations on ClimateWatch. I think that's a really powerful tool and obviously brings a lot of rich information from the NDCs really readily available and drilling, and enables users to drill down. And I think your example of how AI could incorporate to that is really tangible in terms of what is manual could be automated with the power of a large language module. I think there's quite a bit there also. You alluded to, for example, the biannual transparency reports, the national communications. I think that there's a range of other UNFCCC and other UN reporting processes also that we often reference or search for that could also be brought into that. So really, the sky's the limit in terms of where you could take it and build out, for example, ClimateWatch or the other tools that WRI hosts. So thank you for that. That was really good. We've heard of it now in terms of at the AI, in terms of an industry, a sector, what kinds of questions we're looking at. We've drilled in a bit on climate change specifically, and what kinds of tools are out there and how AI is being envisioned to strengthen existing tools. Now I want to turn to more on-the-ground practical solutions that are being delivered in Africa, and what types of ways AI could also empower some of those digital platforms. So I'm pleased to welcome Racine Lee, the Director of Data Management and Technology with Academia 2063. His primary areas of research are in predictive modeling, machine learning techniques applied to geospatial data and crop type classification with unsupervised learning techniques. Racine believes in harnessing technology and digital tools to impact policy and decision-making processes in the agricultural sector, though I know that he works beyond and across much more of the economy-wide solutions encompassed in the NDCs. So welcome, Racine. For you, I think we'd be interested in hearing at the practical level what countries and institutions, what platforms are being developed to enable NDC tracking beyond or in addition to UNFCCC frameworks, specifically thinking about with the Africa Union Commission. And then how are you looking at AI as a new area to enable NDC action at the country level?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, John. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon or evening, everyone. So I am Racine. I work at Academia 2063, which is a nonprofit international research organization. We are headquartered in Kigali, Rwanda, with a regional office for West and Central Africa in Dakar, Senegal. Today, my presentation is a twofold presentation. I'm going to talk about the MRLD platform, that is the African Union tool that will be used to collect data from countries for the terms that are being mentioned, monitoring, reporting, and learning. And second, I'm going to share a few innovations that we are leading at Academia 2063 related to artificial intelligence, and that will also help to feed the platform. Here, I think I'm going to start with an introduction. We are all know aware that climate change is a reality across the world, around the world, and Africa is not spared by the current climate crisis. For example, recently you can see in the news, in the media, that there are some flooding events happening in several countries in the Sahelian regions, and then that is destroying some croplands, human habitat, and biodiversity. Now, if you look at those climate events and the response that countries are providing, some of them are very immediate because there's interventions that are needed. But beyond that, the response to climate crisis is articulated around mitigation and adaptation, as we know. So far in Africa, there are 53 African countries that have their NDCs, but only 17 of them have their national adaptation plans. And there is some improvement that is needed for countries to be able to have their national adaptation plans. For example, in Senegal, there are several projects, and the outputs of those projects will come and feed and nurture the national adaptation plans, for instance. At the regional level, here by regional level, I mean regional economic communities, there are also several initiatives that are channeling the climate-related efforts in the countries. Now, at the continental level, there is a need to have that coordinated aspects of climate, and the bulk of the aforementioned efforts will require such coordination. For example, it means here, for the case of the MRLD platform, to have a receptacle that would allow to track countries' goals and pledges against their NDCs and NAPs. I've seen a question in the chat asking how do we track that. The MRLD in Africa is to start collecting those information and having an accountability process when it comes to achieving those goals. In a nutshell, the way we can explain the MRLD would be to plan at a continental level, to coordinate at the regional level, and then to act at the local and national level. So you have the downstream scheme, that allows actually to spread the information and the goals and the global agendas, to domesticate it at the regional and at the national level, of course, align with the national agendas when it comes to climate. But the upstream way is actually more important because it allows to have the feedback loop, which is essential when it comes to learning, and also to provide some guidance when it comes to revising those NDCs and those NAPs. The MRLD platform is to allow that feedback loop and also that learning, reporting, and monitoring aspects of their climate agenda. As I said, now the African Union recognized that, and then at the continental level, what we want to do here is first to create that medium to provide that receptacle for countries to collect the data and to share it at the African Union level. And the African Union launched its Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan 2022-2032, which is a 10-year strategy and action plan. And in June 2022, they launched it, but now it has been adopted by the African Union Assembly in February 2022. Now, the way we wanted to do this is through digital tool. Why? Because there is a large extent, geographical extent. You have so many countries that are involved. When it comes to African countries, there are between 54 and 55. The diverse human resource involvement in this process, the range of factors that can influence the scope and pace. But not only that, but the availability and the accessibility of the data that changes from one country to another, which is a major problem in Africa. It doesn't mean that data is not collected, but sometimes the availability of that data might be a problem. And here, for example, I can mention the CADEP binary review, electronic binary review, which is the platform that has been built to measure countries' progress when it comes to the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program. And this is the same schema that we would like to replicate here when it comes to climate, and in particular for the monitoring, reporting, and learning platform. Now, the MRLD is will be hosted at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, and will ensure different aspects, for example, to plan intervention outputs, but also to be able to derive from the data strategies for resource mobilization as well. When it comes to the objectives here, the MRLD would like to support the development and the inclusive digital monitoring, reporting, and learning, and also to have automated statistical features, in particular descriptive statistics, that will allow actually to measure where countries are when it comes to achieving their goals, and also their NDCs and the NAPs. We would like also the MRLD to support also the development of capacity at the African Union Commission, the regional economic communities, and the member states to share the experiences while using the MRLD, which is important here because it will help actually to keep improving the platform as we go, or as the countries are implementing their agendas, and as also we learn more from the hurdles that they are experiencing on the ground. And lastly, I mentioned also here the resource mobilization earlier, but most importantly, to start using the data to facilitate the analytics and all the knowledge products that are needed to guide implementation. So here, the MRLD is based on a set of indicators that are being built in partnerships with APTA Associate. We also have ANAPRE, and under the Comprehensive Action Climate Change Initiative and Academia 2063. It's under validation, those indicators that we are implementing on the platform. And here you have a few examples. It will be, of course, it will depend on some security measures, just to be sure that not all individuals in the country will have access to the platform, but we have focal points that will be responsible for sharing the data and collecting it first, and then sharing the data on the platform. That will go all the way up to the regional economic communities for validation, and therefore go to the African Union Commission. And the other way forward also is allowed. Here, a few examples, for example, when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, looking at the African share of greenhouse gas emissions in percentage, but also promoting energy transition. That also is part of the NDCs and NAPs, and so to track what countries are doing on an annual basis. Now, at the end of the process, the data will be collected, validated, and then a report will be also derived and written to share with the member state, which is similar to what we've been doing so far with the electronic binary review as well for the CADEP program. Now, this is for the MRLD, for the African Union Commission, but I would like to also mention a little bit of some AI innovations that we've been doing at Academia 2063 that also can feed the data with for the MRLD. And the first one that I would like to mention here is, for example, the crop type mapping. We know that the agricultural landscape in Africa can be a bit complex because mixed cropping, for example, is a common practice. It is important if it's possible to be able to at least know where some certain crops are growing and what's the extent of those crop lands. And also to start looking at those land management practices that are very tied and related to, for example, those NDCs and the NAPs when it comes to agriculture, fertilizers use, but most importantly, the land use and land cover changes that are one of the aspects that country has to report against in to UNFCCC. So here is a map of Senegal. This is the groundnut basin in Senegal, where we developed a crop map here in for groundnut and compare it between 2023 and 2020 and 2018. Such work has been done also in 5 additional countries, and we are expanding it for the entire continent. Our mandate, Academia, is to serve the entire continent when it comes to each initiative we are trying to operate in. And another work that is already available since late 2019, early 2020 is the Africa Agriculture Watch, which is a platform that uses artificial intelligence and satellite remote sensing data to forecast food crop production in 47 African countries and for 10 crops at the pixel level and before the harvesting period, meaning that you can know how much a country will produce for certain crops before the harvesting period and with a certain level of accuracy. That data is available, openly accessible 24/7, and you can download it with different formats. Either it is an image or a TIFF file, a raster file, if one might want to do more analysis on the data. And here, our hope is to make that data available to government so far, and also all the stakeholders that are involved in the sector. Another one is tracking greenhouse gases emissions across the continent. This is a report, a chapter within a report that we published a few weeks ago. And here you can see the average methane emissions in Africa. And the issue here was not are we emitting or not. The issue was how much are we emitting and defining a baseline when it comes to methane emission, for example. And you can see here for the panel in the middle, comparing the methane emissions in Mali for croplands versus non-croplands and through time. And the third panel is for Senegal and for Niger, sorry. And we'll look at the correlation between greenhouse gases, here in particular methane, versus land surface temperature and rainfall, and the crop calendar for certain crops and through time. That way we start seeing the dynamic of methane. And we would like to use this actually also to support countries having a more realistic carbon budget when it comes to reporting. And such is something that they can use for the MRLD as well. And lastly, I would like also to share here one work that is ongoing, but will be soon ready for also the MRLD. Actually, it will be openly accessible, which is the tree carbon density. We know that when countries report to the UNFCCC, they consider forests that are classified as forest. But when it comes to the national forest inventories, they don't consider forests that are trees that are outside of forests that still will store carbon. And here we start looking at those trees in the Sahel, because this is where we have less forest, but sparse vegetation and trees, and start measuring the tree carbon density. Another effort that we'll be doing is to look at the value of those trees if they happen to be in the carbon market, here in particular, the voluntary carbon market. The idea here is just to support even more the African countries to have a more realistic carbon budget when they report, not to have a over or underestimated carbon budget when reporting to the UNFCCC. And we hope that those innovation using AI will come and nurture the MRLD to have a more realistic figure. Therefore, decision making and some rearrangement could be done for the better good. Let me stop here for now, and thank you so much for having us and for your attention. Back to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Racine. That's a really good example of much more specifically where AI is coming in and can help build in more information, more deep data, I suppose, in terms of what countries can do for their climate commitments and how that can be added to existing digital platforms, for example, the AUC's MRLD platform. I'm going to move into some questions and answers. We've pulled together some from the chat. I'm going to start with you, Leandro, just in terms of the ClimateWatch platform. Can we track the country level climate finance data from ClimateWatch? And maybe just if you can quickly clarify if you can search other sectors like agriculture and food systems.
Yeah, thank you, John. I was having some fun going through the questions. Great questions, by the way. Let me see. I'm trying to share screen. So yes, we do have indicators and sub-indicators on agriculture and food systems. So I would encourage to explore the sectoral adaptation measures as well as the mitigation measures. So for adaptation, we have agriculture and then sub-indicators on agroecology, agroforestry, food security, different topics. And then if you have a specific crop or something else that it's more niche, you can also use the NDC keyword search. And also very quickly tackling the questions on climate finance. Yes, we have a specific category on finance and support. And then from there, we keep track of whether countries have any conditional, unconditional, or a mixture of both specified to comply with their NDCs. And then several other indicators on actual numbers. So have they identified the total economic loss of current loss and damage? Have they identified financial requirements in total, financial requirements for adaptation, for mitigation? So if the NDC has that information, we have extracted that and it's available in here. Say you're interested in adaptation, you can see that only 8 parties have it. If they're too small here, you can go to the table underneath. And all the data that we have, it's available for download. So you only have to click here and then go to Data Explorer, and you'll be able to download the data from here.
Thank you for clarifying that, Leandro. I mean, it really is a pretty deep tool, and the amount of work that's gone into pulling together that information and having it sortable like that is really impressive. Again, on ClimateWatch, is it tracking the true implementation of NDC-related projects or just assessing the difference between NDC version? And then, are there any major assumptions within the tool itself?
And I think I quickly covered that. Unfortunately, that's a really huge topic because on the one end, we keep track of all the NDCs and everything that a country is promising to do. And then the immediate next question is, are they complying with it? Are they doing it? And the answer is that we don't keep track of implementation on ClimateWatch. For that, I think there are other platforms, but I don't think there's any that does it comprehensively. The one thing I want to mention regarding implementation, because it's such a big topic that we get asked all the time, we're thinking, and we have some scoping ideas on analyzing BTRs, the biennial transparency reports, because countries are required to report on the progress on their NDCs. So by analyzing the BTRs, we could have indicators to show side by side the NDCs and what have been implemented. But that's only at the scoping phase so far.
Agree. I've looked for similar data sets and also found it very difficult to just get a good comprehensive overview of what specifically is being implemented and that progress in a centralized place. So a huge kind of potential there for AI and big data to have that synthesis really quick and efficiently ready to pull from. But maybe there are other tools. So moving into a related question for Leandro and Leland, do any of the tools you've presented or are aware of provide assessments of how aligned each country's NDC is with the Paris Agreement 1.5-degree temperature goal? And if not, are you aware of tools that provide such assessments, or what would it take to include such a feature in ClimateWatch?
Happy to go first, Leland. And again, I'm gonna very quickly share screen. The immediate answer, at least for ClimateWatch, if we show the alignment with the Paris Agreement, it would be sort of no. You can see the alignment between different NDCs. So we do have a module. If you go to commitments and then compare all targets, and then from here you have all different countries in the rows, and then each column represents an NDC version. So here, let's say we want to see the progress of Brazil, for example. So you can click on the updated first NDC, NDC, and INDC, and then we click compare. Now from here, you can see once again the 4 different tabs that we saw earlier, and then 1 column per NDC version. And here you can see side by side if the country has increased their ambition or not. You can see it from here, the GHG target, has it changed? We can see that it moved. Brazil is not the best example for this because they changed the baseline years, but you can easily compare on all the indicators that we keep track of. And then in terms of assessment, if the NDC is aligned with the Paris Agreement or not, I would recommend the Climate Action Tracker, and I can share the link in the chat. They are also in the space of analyzing NDCs. The main difference that we have with them is that while we share very transparently all different indicators and we take extracts from the NDCs, they go a step further, we can say, and they make an assessment of, for example, all their sectoral mitigation targets, mitigation policies from the country, and they assess whether it is 1.5 aligned or not. And they do that for, I think, 40 countries. So that will be a resource that I would recommend if you're interested in that alignment.
Yeah, and just to add to that, obviously, alignment with, those temperature goals, there's a number of different answers that could come out of that. It's not necessarily just sort of a yes or no. There's some interpretation that would go into it. This is the kind of space where, obviously one option is to sort of go through and make those judgments and assessments yourself. There's certainly room to, you could, in theory, build some sort of, large language model or text analysis tool to try to, interpret that at scale. Obviously, a lot of the concerns that we talked about earlier in terms of making sure the model is well trained, that it's not making things up, et cetera, would be paramount in terms of implementing something like that. But Leandro and his team have obviously done a great deal on structuring a lot of this data and making sure it's really well understood. And that's the kind of thing that would certainly be possible, I would think.
Maybe just one last one for you, Leandro. ClimateWatch, I think, has really raised a lot of questions, and there's a lot of interest from the participants. But just generally, what are the main uses of the data set that you've seen, or if you can just kind of quickly give a summary of like how people are really going in there and pulling out some of the quick information that's available to ClimateWatch.
Yeah, so we get around 20,000 users a month. So our user base ranges from people in the academia to NGOs and the public that we're the most interested in, which are ministries and big organizations supporting ministries. And so some of the most usual use cases that we get are sometimes from ministries teams that they go there and then basically they put side by side their country and other countries that are similar either in size or in economic development, and then see how they are doing it, how they compare. That could be one use case. We have also had calls with several ministries of different countries around the world. We also explain, for example, the actions and mitigation, for example, measures that a country could take compared to others in the area. And then if not, it's really good for reporting. I mostly showed information on NDCs. So anyone working on health and climate, they could go into our platform and basically raise the issue that only 4 NDCs around the world are mentioning health concerns related to climate change, or that incorporate youth and child sensitivity analysis into the NDCs. It really depends on what topic you're covering. I think it's really good to basically get a sense on how much a topic it's being considered. And then I didn't show it in the demo, but aside from the NDCs and the climate documents that we also have inventories on greenhouse gas emissions from all countries. And that's really the biggest use case that we have on ClimateWatch. And then we've incited in 35 different NDCs with our data. And countries tend to go and use the ClimateWatch inventory data to say, my country, which represents 2% of global emissions. So we also have a lot of those citations or comparison emissions between countries.
Thank you, Leandro. It's really helpful. Racine, several questions your way. We only have a few minutes left, but I just wanted to make sure that we get a chance to get a better sense of the MRLD and how it's being used and kind of how you envision some of its power there. So could you elaborate on how the AU and individual member states might use the MRLD to attract investments for climate mitigation and adaptation actions that are aligned with their priorities?
Yes. Thank you for that. Actually, the MRLD is built in collaboration with them, meaning that there are some indicators that will come from countries. That is the part that helps us to align the indicators with what countries would like to do. And second, how do we link those indicators with the global agenda as well, the NDCs and the NAPs? So meaning that the data that we'll be collecting from them will support the first the coordination at the African Union Commission and also the implementation at the country level. So when it comes to like getting more resources, of course, if you get the indicators and you see there are improvement or there are some shortcomings, therefore we can start working with the countries, asking them what are the difficulties there to support them.
Thank you. Great, super concise answer. Maybe just one follow-on, or if you can explain it, how efficiently you can measure progress in West African countries to access accurate and timely data where data is limited and difficult to obtain.
Yeah. We use two ways. The first one is to work directly with the country partners that are responsible to file the data and to report to the UNFCCC. There we have access to the data. Now, do they have the most recent data or not? That is another issue, but where possible, we also use satellite remote sensing data ourselves to supplement the data they have to make sure that we can at least have a proxy when it comes to some indicators. Now, for the case of Senegal is, for example, CSE, Centre de Suivi Écologique, Environmental Monitoring, that we work with, and they are responsible for the country to report on those agendas.
Great. Appreciate the kind of also the summary on how local organizations are feeding into this as well. Thank you all to our panelists. I think this has been a really rich conversation. Obviously could have gone on for hours, but there's a lot of information that you have, and we really appreciate the information that you provided. On our screen is our next webinar for Cassie, the Partnerships for NDC Success, spotlighting our partner Genesis Energy on November 6th at 9 a.m. Thank you to participants for coming in and hearing our presentations today. We hope that it's generated some new questions and ideas in terms of how you and your organizations that you work with can better use big data and AI to drive your own agendas. I think we can close here, and I'll hand back to our ACE program team for final words.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Everyone.